Well, this took longer than expected. Hopefully, you enjoyed your holidays in the meantime. It's a new year for all of us, and so let me get straight to the point. The time has come. This is the legacy of Cain.
Soul Reaver, my angel of death.
Dear Lord. Talk about a gem that was almost lost to time, huh? It's been 21 years since our last game from the Legacy of Kain series, and it all started with Blood Omen, developed by Silicon Knights in 1996, following up with Soul Reaver in 1999, developed by Crystal Dynamics and published by Eidos, along with every other game released after this, such as Soul Reaver 2 in 2001, Blood Omen making a return with a sequel in 2002. Then finally, The Legacy of Kain Defiance, released in 2003. This was basically Blood Omen 3 and Soul Reaver 3 put together as a means of a conclusion. Now, people are going to argue about that statement and how the story was unfinished or how it should have just kept going, so let me put this out there before you rage by saying, save that kind of talk for another time. In a Defiance video? Sure, why not? But we're not rushing in on Defiance or the Legacy of Kain series. For now, the 2 remasters that was just released last year is good enough. Besides, we still gotta talk about Pandora Tomorrow. Well, anyway, Blood Omen talks about the story of Cain before he sacrificed the Seraphan lieutenants to become his vampire guardians of the Pillars, while the Soul Reaver series talks about one of the Seraphan humans who not only was converted as a vampire, but was also resurrected, and he goes through the current state of Nosgoth under the brink of collapse. Defiance brings their stories together, leaving them to determine their fates in the endgame. Later down the road, we've had some insights from Eidos about a cancelled project from the same series. You play as a different character this time, but still relating to the story of Nosgoth and some compassion. Now, ever since this project was cancelled, the Legacy of Kain series was laid to rest. Well, here we are now in 2024, actually it's 25, with 2 remastered games by Aspire and Saber, Soul Reaver 1 and 2. Raziel has risen up from the dead once again to summon his Reaver Blade and claim his vengeance. We're living in strange times where you think a certain franchise would never find its way to the surface in our current time, but the second we turn around, Soul Reaver just so happens to come back. Alright, look, if Soul Reaver can come back, that means anything can come back at this point. So that should give me some sort of hope for Shadow Monks to come back, right? It's fine. You don't have to tell me. Now, if you play games like the Halo Master Chief Collection, then you probably are aware that you can press a button and it changes back the original graphics. This idea was brought over to the Soul Reaver 1 and 2 Remastered, and it's a nice feature to have, giving you some idea on how they changed some of its details, whether it be cleaned up or upscaled. This would be a good way to compare the old with the new, but if you're gonna do it properly, you gotta go with the original and do a side comparison. Before we get into the remastered versions, let me quickly show you the original games. Now, what you see here is the Dreamcast version of the original Soul Reaver. Most individuals grew up with the PlayStation version. However, when it comes to the original, the Dreamcast is the best one. And unfortunately, in my case, for the first game is long gone. But luckily, the disc is still in great condition. Not to mention, here we also have Soul Reaver 2 on the PlayStation 2. Now, because this is only a disc, there's no way for me to show you its manual unless you go online. But if we go to the second game, the whole package is here. Game, case, and manual, complete in box. My only problem with the manual is that it's in black and white, but as you look through the pages on this thick booklet, you can tell the people behind this project put in so much time and detail to everything. They've got character descriptions, controller layouts, background stories, they even go in depth with the abilities you acquire. They also have a promo art design for Blood Omen 2 on the back. Now here's the deal. The remastered versions will be shown as planned, but it's going to go in and out of order with the Dreamcast playthrough. Either way, both will remain on that same subject, and to that end, the remastered versions are literally 1-to-1. And to my knowledge, after going through both playthroughs, there doesn't seem to be any differences when it comes to gameplay, but that exception is overruled when it comes to graphics. Character models will remain to look more like what you see in the promos. Backgrounds have more clear and sharp details. Music and sound effects are played out to sound like its original lossless quality. And of course, 16:9 aspect ratio as opposed to the 4:3 ratio from the original. Well, of course, start with the first Soul Reaver. The Dreamcast will be displayed using a VGA cable, but it's being converted to a component converter since this TV doesn't have a VGA output. The remastered versions is released on PS4, Xbox Series, the Switch, Steam, or GOG on PC, and the version that will be shown here is GOG on PC. As for my PC, this is the GPD Win 4, the latest gaming handheld device that can pretty much play almost any modern game released today. And if you have a Steam Deck, it'll work on there too. The opening cutscene starts with 5 vampire guardians surrounding the pillars of Nosgoth, and sitting at the throne is the ruler of these lands, Cain, who was once human but was killed at one point and resurrected as a vampire. Some time ago, there were other guardians in charge of these pillars called the Circle of Nine. Cain is a part of this group and has eliminated almost every one of the guardians in this circle, leaving him to remain as the last guardian standing in this era. Soon he resurrected 6 souls to become the next guardians and his lieutenants, leaving 2 pillars to be left open for reservation. One of them happens to be the character we take control of, Raziel, firstborn of his lieutenants. Him and his brothers before Cain served him for over a millennium. Over time, vampires were outgrowing the human society as they began to decimate, and because of their immortality, Cain's powers was growing exponentially, and his lieutenants would soon follow. Raziel confronts the Cain and shows his confidence that he has surpassed his lord, growing wings before him and the rest of his brethren. Cain was filled with jealousy and anger, driving him to rip the bones off his wings, ruined for good. 2 of his brothers, Torel and Dumas, dragged Raziel into the cliff of the abyss, and as punishment for treason, Cain ordered them to throw Raziel into the lake of the dead, and as he suffers from burning, he falls into the vortex, and within that time, centuries have passed. Raziel is resurrected as a Spectra by an Elder God, the only Elder God Raiden will never consult to. This Elder God controls the Wheel of Fate, the souls of the dead, but it's trapped and can no longer be turned for resurrection. Raziel is only lucky to have his soul stay within the corpse because the Elder God believes he has a destiny to fulfill. Not only does he have a debt to pay to this god, but is also given an offer to avenge himself, to destroy Cain and his brothers. Now, we don't necessarily need to go over all the differences in this video. In fact, you'll be able to tell yourselves on which is which and what looks better to you. Before we go any further, let's address the elephant in the room. Did they do anything with the controls? Do they feel different? Does it play better than the original? When it comes to controller support, yes, major improvement. In terms of how it's played, nothing has changed. It's the exact same game you played on the original. Just better graphics, better frame rate, that's it. From both versions, everything controls the same. The only difference from the Dreamcast besides photo mode is the second analog to control the camera. The Dreamcast uses the D-pad to rotate the camera on the X-axis. The camera is set to follow Raziel wherever he turns. Most of the time it works, but sometimes you'll need to manually adjust. With the L trigger as crouch and R trigger to sneak or lock on, you'll have to hold both triggers to look around with the analog. The remaster only has you hold the right bumper and look around with the right stick. Raziel at first is a vulnerable vampire, but as he defeats his brothers he gains their abilities and all of a sudden becomes the Daywalker. First he can walk through gates, only in the spectral realm. Then he gains the Soul Reaver after confronting Cain for the first time. He then can climb certain walls, and he also gains the telekinetic force powers to throw projectiles, and can even use that with his Reaver. He also has the ability to swim underwater without dying, and turn objects. Okay, cool. Soul Reaver's whole game is all about discovering areas, solving block puzzles, killing your brothers, and trying to find Cain. Mostly killing your brother's kids and solving block puzzles, but let's start with his current state of living, because Raziel can now roam between life and death, or in other words, the material realm, which is the land of the living, and the spectral realm, the land of the dead. The spectral realm oversaturates the whole area into a ghostly atmospheric distortion. We're talking from the way it looks to how the tone of the music drops. There are places you need to travel across or upwards that require you to go in between these dimensions. They change certain platforms that give you some sort of leverage, or in other cases like water. Before gaining the ability to swim by defeating Rahab, Raziel is forced to be in the spectral realm should he ever be surrounded as such. Water areas don't exist in the spectral realm and only act as a common area to travel on foot. In the spectral realm, you are limited to what you can do. You can't interact with anything outside the material realm like switches, doors, weapons, torches, glyphs, or even climbing on walls. Enemies you encounter here are either the lost souls like the scavengers, or the dementors who want to suck the life out of your souls. When in doubt, shout out Expecto Patronum. Once you have the Soul Reaver, it's with you at all times, even when getting hurt. It's an easy one to swing, but it gets boring doing that for a while. But you can't forget to lock on with the R trigger, and he is very agile and moving. It's the best way to get through everyone. Just dash forward and he'll automatically attack like a madman. Raziel is still among the dead, and so he no longer feeds on his victims for blood, but instead their souls. Every enemy defeated will have their soul come out, and all you do is remove the hood to feed onto the soul and replenish your health. Your only way of traveling back to the material realm is to find these blue portals on the ground with full health. Whichever is your select button will take you to the glyph selection, and this emblem right here will take you to the material realm. In the land of the living, centuries have passed and the children of your brothers are born, roaming all over the lands of Nosgoth. Despite Raziel being a vampire, they don't find him as a friendly commoner, rightfully so. We can get a little more depth into combat since we can interact with almost anything. Before getting the Reaver, you are left with only your bare claws and broken wings, so for the time being, on your travels, you will find weapons that are against the wall to use as your levers against your foes. As such, dashing forward will launch Raziel to attack and repeatedly so. While holding on the weapon, you can hold the Y button for a throw. At long distance, you can go for a quick impale on an enemy as a surprise attack. Or even the torch could do the trick. Whacking your enemies with fire is fun and all, but setting them on fire? Now that's epic. While looking around, you can aim your weapon wherever you want to throw, although it can be quite confusing since the camera zooms in so close, so it can be tough to see where you throw. Luckily, you don't have to rely on it so much since throwing your weapon will automatically lock onto your enemy depending on the distance. Vampires have their own weaknesses you can use against them, like throwing them into spiked territories, bright sunlights, a pool of water,
Unfettered from the flesh, a creature's soul fades swiftly into the spectral realm.
or even fire pits. You need to whack the enemies enough times before they get dizzy, then you can grab onto them for a toss. You can even be crazy enough to carry them to the Lake of the Dead, and toss them in like their fathers did to you. Now if you have the Reaver, this will stabilize Raziel's health until he gets hit. In the material realm, the Soul Reaver is more vulnerable to be lost than kept, so you have to do your best not to get hit. But if you do, you'll need to rely on the enemy's souls to replenish your health and get your Reaver back. Enemies in the material realm aren't exactly hard, but there are a couple that will test you on your dodging, like these spider monkeys, or the brute strength of these minotaurs. Without pointing out the obvious of wide open spaces, the first quarter of the game does a well job in keeping you streamlined so that you don't stray away from the main path. But once Raziel kills his first brother and you get out of his lair, you start to do some backtracking. After killing a boss, the Elder God will aid you on where to go next. But if you don't pay attention at all, you're either going to be lost or you'll end up in a cave doing a block puzzle thinking you're doing something right, only to discover that you've just spent 20 plus minutes to gain a glyph ability. Unless you're used to exploring all around, Soul Reaver is going to make you feel like you need intelligence. It can be quite difficult sometimes, especially if it comes to tight platforms. Although most of the game consists of basic platforming skills, there are quite a few sections where it'll challenge you on your jumps. Ever played Tomb Raider? You get the idea on where this is going. It's just a matter of getting a habit of releasing the stick right after you land, because if you move, you'll slip right off. Raziel doesn't have wings to fly, despite them being ruined. It can be used to glide, traveling long distances to reach the next platform if you can. Sometimes you use them on wind areas to fly up. When it comes to backtracking, it's less of a headache than you'd anticipate thanks to these portal rooms located in almost every area you visit. You see, there are moments where you discover a path that requires a certain ability, such as going through the fence for a glyph, climbing up a wall for an artifact, or another way by all means to locate your next brother. Now once you gain an ability that grants access to the next room, these portal rooms are quick to bring you to the next area you need to go to. What's interesting is that Soul Reaver barely even loads, especially when playing on the Dreamcast. The only time it ever has to load is when going through a door, and that only takes less than 5 seconds before you start moving around. Even when going through different portal rooms, traveling is instant. In almost every path you take, you've got a puzzle to solve. Block puzzles to be exact, and these puzzles consist of things like connecting the tubes together, matching the artwork that goes with the frame, or even lifting them up to 3 stories just to reach a high place. You may spend a good amount of time on these puzzles, but when you do unlock a glyph, they serve another means of eliminating your enemies easily. You could go straight into combat and kill with your Reaver, of course, but sometimes you want to get a move on. With the glyph selection, you have the option to do quite a few things. The Force glyph to send your opponents away. It works best when they're surrounded by a pool of water. The Stone glyph freezes all your opponents, leaving them to be easily executed by the swing of your Reaver. The Sound glyph. It won't do much other than stun all your surrounding enemies in an instant. Water glyph. It should kill these vampires, but it does nothing to them, so it's a terrible glyph. Then of course the Fire and Sun glyph. They both do the same thing by burning these vampires to a crisp. Glyphs have their own set of points, kinda like the mana system. With each glyph you find, the more points you earn, which allows you to use these glyphs more than once. Enemies will drop glyph points after taking their souls, or you can stand in an area that has the blue symbol on the ground to fully replenish. There are secret rooms to discover that grants you extra glyph points to gain, as well as the artifact pieces. By finding 5 of these artifacts, you will gain a health upgrade, 15 in total. Keep in mind that these health grades only apply in the material realm and it has no effect in the spectral realm. The best ability that you gain in my opinion is the telekinetic force projectile. Whether it's just your bear claws or the Reaver, you can spam this power and blockade a vampire up against the corner with no limits whatsoever. And not only do you use this on your enemies, but if there's a block that you need to move, you can use this power to do the job, which actually makes it so much easier than to push or drag the block around. The telekinetic power works both in the material and the spectral realm. On top of earning that power, if you look around in Rahab's area, you'll find the spot that converts your Reaver into a Flame Reaver. By unlocking this power, you can go into any fire pit you encounter and set a flame to your Reaver. So when you use the telekinetic power, you can shoot fireballs, and all it takes is 2 hits before death. As for the boss fights, well, they're not exactly boss fights. Melchiah is the first boss you encounter. You jump over here to pull the switch, then you wait for him to show up at the right time to close the gate on him. You do this twice, and then you circle around till he enters the center gate before you drop the spikes on him. And then he gives you the ability to walk through gates in the spectral realm. Before meeting with the rest of them, you confront Cain first. And he can be tricky with how he teleports before you get the chance to attack, but all it takes is 1 hit 3 times and he's done. Pretty simple. The worst that he can do is send you back to the spectral realm using his Reaver, because once you come back, you'll get your shot once more. Then you get the Reaver and encounters Zephon, who has merged himself with his own territory in a cocoon, so he's pretty much stationary. He drops eggs out of his sack, you grab that, go near the entrance and use the enemy's flame torch to set the egg on fire and throw it at Zephon 3 times, and you'll kill him and have the ability to climb walls. Rahab is a joke. So long as you don't touch water, all you need to do is shoot out all the windows to let the sunlight burn him to a crisp, and once he's done, you'll have the ability to swim underwater. Dumas is an easy kill, but also kind of annoying. You have to let him chase you for a while till you get to this room so that you can set him on fire. And the problem with that is if you run too far, he'll go back to his chair, which makes you track all the way back to his room to have him chase you again. As long as you know where you're going while the camera is facing you, you'll never have him leave your sight. But as for his power, this is where you can turn objects like these statues to close one door and to open another. Probably the one power-up that's practically useless as a whole, but is only used in situational purposes. Like the beginning in Raziel's territory, you use this sitter dong to turn and open the other bridges and you find yourself a new artifact and extra glyph points. Well anyway, because we have Dumas' power, we can get inside Cain's stronghold to find him. Once you do, we go through another boss fight with him, quote unquote. It's the same fight as the first, except it's less space and more jumping to do. By the time you get to the last hit is where it becomes a little complicated. But after he's done, he jumps into the portal and Raziel goes for the chase. Alright, so with Soul Reaver's gameplay explained, we can get into the story. But before we jump into that, we need to address the cutscenes and voice actors behind these characters because, my god. Listen, we can spend all day mocking on their stable motions in place or how they move their arms when they're talking, but we cannot disregard the intriguing dialogue exchange between Raziel, the Elder God, and Cain. Or just listening to Raziel narrate his surroundings and shares his stories nonchalantly to us players. In the original, these cutscenes couldn't be skipped other than the first intro, so you didn't have a choice but to be forced to watch. It didn't really matter because Soul Reaver somehow was able to just pull you in. With talent like these voice actors had, they made you feel like you were watching a movie. And we haven't even touched on Soul Reaver 2 just yet. At least in the remaster it gives you that option to skip if you want. But as a first time player, even if you don't understand the story, don't skip these cutscenes. They're great to watch and they're great to listen to, especially when Raziel and Kain have their dialogue exchange. Well anyway, let's start with his resurrection. So Raziel has a debt to pay to this elder god, reviving him. He too wants to have Kain be eliminated so that the Wheel of Fate can begin to turn once more. Life, death, and rebirth cannot continue the cycle unless the root of the problem has been deceased, which happens to be Kain. The last guardian of the pillars remain, and if he isn't killed, the vampire race will continue to grow, along with their powers, and the human society will cease to exist. After leaving the spectral realm and finding himself back into the material realm, Raziel discovers that time between his execution and resurrection is centuries past, with Nosgoth under the brink of collapse unless the pillars are restored. While on his journey to eliminate his brothers, he also discovers that his clan is long gone, so he confronts the Kain and discovers that all of his brothers could not handle their enhanced transformations, and therefore every one of them looks hideous. Not only that, but his entire clan have either deceased or they became one of the grunts he killed. With Kain's only excuse at the moment was to embrace a new era and erase the old. His plan to kill Kain was still absolute, but so was his, revealing the Soul Reaver blade, an old blade that's lived for thousands of years and has the ability to devour the victim of their souls because of a curse it's been possessed. By getting the best of him, it wasn't enough to stop Kain, so he used his sword to try and kill Raziel, but ends up smashing it into pieces. From Kain's perspective, it seemed that this act of destruction towards the blade was intentional, fading out of place as he chuckled and Raziel falling into the spectral realm. The soul of the blade was summoned upon him, and now he carries what's called the Wraith Reaver. The Soul Reaver from the inside was bound to him. We also get to meet one of the guardian souls that could not be turned for resurrection, Ariel. Almost dressed to look like the female version of Two-Face, she's stuck for eternity near the pillars until Kain makes his sacrifice for the wheel to turn. So now Raziel continues his search for the rest of his brothers after killing Melchiah, starting with Siphon at the tower. It's a long journey to get up top, but there's nothing important about him except how ugly he turned out to be. So we'll do him a favor and spare his suffering. Later down the road, Raziel finds the tomb of the Seraphim warriors. He, among his 5 other brothers' names, were written above these coffins. Raziel was a vampire before becoming a resurrected demon, but even before that life, he was actually human, a Seraphim priest, those that fought the very thing they once were, the vampires, a war within himself and his brothers on both sides. Kain was the one who brought these men to life as vampires, and it was Kain who put him on the spot as a traitor and became what we see now. To Raziel, everything seems to lead up to Kain as the root of all problems. With that discovery in mind, Raziel continues to search for his brothers and eliminate them. Rahab is the next boss after Siphon and the only vampire race in Nosgoth that has the skin to swim underwater. That still doesn't matter because sunlight is enough to kill him anyway. Next we go to Dumas. Apparently he was set up for an ambush by the Hildens, the only vampire that was defeated in a sense, quote unquote, because once you remove those wooden staffs off of him, he's back to life, ready to go after you. To be fair, it was him and Rahab that threw Raziel into the pit, so his punishment is well deserved. Now we get to Kain's stronghold, and as you travel through this maze, you'll end up finding a statue of Mobius, the time streamer, a foreshadowing moment that is yet to happen until you find Kain inside the time chamber. Then as you travel through this hallway, you'll be interrupted by these portals that give you a glimpse on the events that happened prior, such as Raziel's resurrection, the Reaver being smashed, Raziel locating the tomb of the Seraphim. Then he's also shown hypothetical timelines, such as him killing the soul of Ariel as the Reaver consumes her soul, or when Kain dies and the Reaver is now a fully powerful Soul Reaver. Raziel finally reaches the door that leads him inside the time chamber where Kain lies. Alright, so before battling it out, Kain explains that everyone including them has a predetermined destiny, which Mobius has foretold him eons ago, and so he believes free will is an illusion. So rather than change the events in the present, since it's inevitable to save Nosgoth in this state, he's set up to change the events in the past. Raziel confronts him about the Seraphim tomb, exposing him for turning the Seraphim priest into his vampires. They wanted to prevent this catastrophe with the pillars, but the damage was done so long ago by Cain. But according to him, he has only scratched the surface of what really happened behind the scenes. Either way, Raziel isn't too happy about the aftermath, living as an animated corpse. And after their battle, Cain lures Raziel into the portal as he escapes. Before leaving, the Elder God warns him that he'll be out of his reach if he goes through. He ignores his warning and jumps into the portal, pursuing Cain, but is snatched out of a different area to meet with the time streamer himself, Mobius. And that's how Soul Reaver ends. Anticlimactic, right? Yep, get used to that. Now here's something that piqued my curiosity. Here in the original, if you start a new game and pause, you would hold the triggers down and press the appropriate combination buttons to unlock cheats for your gameplay. You can do things like unlock all your abilities, including the Reaver and the telekinesis, or unlock all the glyphs and its upgrades, including health. We can also change the Reaver into either Flame, Ariel's Reaver, or Cain's Reaver. Since we could do that in the original, what if we could do the same thing in the remaster? No way. The cheats work in the remastered edition. Okay, that's pretty cool. On top of equipping all of the cheats, you can practically break the game and head straight to the stronghold and find Cain without having to encounter Raziel's brothers once. Huh. Who would have thought the cheats would work in the remastered? Well, anyway, let's get into Soul Reaver 2. And from here, we'll just continue the story where we left off because Soul Reaver 2 is the meat and bones. Now we got actual cutscenes, long cutscenes that have characters animate, move around, and talk as opposed to them just standing there in stable motion. But to cut some slack, going from Soul Reaver 1 and 2 is literally going from PS1 to PS2. It's hard to show that in the remastered game, but from the originals, even the Dreamcast to PlayStation 2 is still a big jump. Now the original Soul Reaver 2 is being recorded on my backwards compatibility PlayStation 3, and is set to 480p using Component. Let's take one step back just to throw this note out here by saying, look, this will be explained to the best of my ability because this part of the story goes in depth. We're talking about connections with Blood Omen, and this is coming from someone who's only experienced the Legacy of Kain series, it's the Soul Reaver games, and Defiance. So if you feel like you need to add something to the story, or need to make a correction, definitely put it down in the comments. There's no shame in it. Soul Reaver 2 picks up exactly where the first game left off, but think of it this way. As soon as you're about to open those doors to enter through the time chamber, the opening cutscene of Soul Reaver 2 begins. Almost everything that was said in the ending is the same here. They have their words exchanged. The fight was more clear to see how Cain still overpowers Raziel, for now. So rather than looking like Cain lost, he just dips into the portal like it was a flawless victory. Raziel, of course, chases after him, and we left off with him meeting Mobius for the first time, snatched by him so they could have a talk before going after Cain. Which wasn't a smart idea since Raziel was more than pissed at this point, and now has to deal with another foe. Mobius is the time streamer, and in this era, he is the leader of the vampire hunters. Much like the Seraphim who want to honor their soldiers for fighting for the same cause. He carries the staff that neutralizes vampires and their powers, with Raziel's Soul Reaver being affected. Raziel was clueless to know that he and Mobius were close back when he was a Seraphim priest, and he tries to get on Raziel's good side, sympathizing for him since Cain has put him through a lot. He explains to him that they have a common enemy that needs to be stopped, as he shows his care for Nosgoth. He also shows that Cain stands before the pillars, which are actually standing up like normal in this time, as opposed to the current timeline where it's collapsed, and with this in mind, that means they've gone as far back in time as right after the Seraphim have just been extinguished. Cain awaits for Raziel, who thought he was following him earlier, and Raziel is willing to listen to whatever Mobius has to tell him just to gather information, but he doesn't hold any punches. Despite these two having a common enemy, Raziel doesn't trust Mobius at all, and is aware of his schemes. Though this may bother Mobius at first, it doesn't matter in the end so long as he knows Raziel will get the job done. If there's anything worth trusting him over, it would be one simple matter. Mobius, as the time streamer, has seen many things unfold, and one of them happens to be that Cain would be the one to kill him in the next 30 years. He's left to fend for himself in escaping the stronghold. He enters the main hallway away from the staff, and the Reaver returns. Raziel then sees a portrait of Cain back from Blood Omen, going up against King William the Just, a fight orchestrated by Mobius. What lies beneath this the statue holding on to the Reaver blade, but is broken into two, the aftermath of what had happened during that battle. Raziel's Reaver, out of its own will, released, connecting itself to the Reaver blade and forced it together. And Raziel felt himself slipping away from his conscience, but before he could, The blade was then removed out of the statue, and as he held onto it, he felt himself come back and the two Reavers connecting through a strong bond, but he was also fighting for control. Mobius shows up, pulling a stupid move by not bringing his staff, but in his defense, he tries to prove that he still has good intentions towards Raziel, which is now impossible for him to recall on that act. As soon as he first held on to that Reaver, Raziel was able to see all the battles and all the enemies defeated by this very blade, and he had the choice to kill him there and now. But Mobius confesses that he too serves the same Elder God as he, the demands of the Wheel of Fate. Raziel was satisfied enough to see that Mobius fears him, but is also sick of his act. He released the blade, and leaves the stronghold to go look for Cain, but now has a quarrel with the Elder God the second he gets to talk to him. On his journey, he is distracted by other portraits before him. Back in the sanctuary near the time chambers, there is a portrait of Vordor. In Mobius' perspective, Vordor is a masochist. In this very room, he invaded the stronghold and deliberately killed the entire circle with only 3 who managed to survive, Mobius being one of them, which of course means that he was, or still is, the Guardian of Time. Wait a minute, did you hear me say Cain killed everyone in the beginning? My apologies. That's just what happens when you learn one thing from one game and learn another in the next game. In the main hallway was Janos Aldrin, who carried a legendary artifact, the Heart of Darkness, and it restores vampiric unlife, which means being alive without a soul. Apparently the Seraphim ripped it off, stored it safely in their stronghold, safeguarding it. Raziel travels outside the stronghold and roams outside the world of Nosgoth until he reaches for the pillars and finds Cain, casually waiting for him while Raziel fails to sneak up on him. This scene is very iconic to anyone who is a fan of the series. Raziel is persistent in getting into a conflict argument or battle it out with Cain despite him trying to settle the differences here and give him the explanation he needs to hear to understand the choices he had to make. He shortly explains how the Pillars was corrupted in Blood Omen. Ariel is the human guardian of balance, and she was killed by a dark entity. After her death, her role as the guardian of balance was passed on to Cain at birth. Ariel's beloved Nuprapture, the Mind Guardian, finds her corpse. Sensing a hint of betrayal, he goes insane, using his powers to send a curse on all of the Guardians, including Cain, unbeknownst. And since every single one of them is tainted by this curse, the Pillars transitioned into stone, thus beginning the corruption of the Pillars. Cain believes that this was orchestrated expertly, with the Circle of Nine going into chaos, corrupted the lands of Nosgoth. After the first 30 years of his life, he is presented with a dilemma, 2 options in which he refers to as a 2-sided coin. If he sacrifices himself, not only will that restore the Pillars, but also wiping out the entire vampire race, which is exactly what Mobius wants him to do. Or he refuses to die, and resumes the corruption Nosgoth faces as the Pillars collapse. With those options in mind, the decision he makes is rigged either way. But according to Cain, the Pillars belong to the vampires, and so he wants to find a way to restore both Nosgoth and save the vampire race, which is where he presents a third option, a coin that may one day fall on its edge if thrown enough times. This is a secret that Cain wants Raziel to discover. He thinks he's the only one that might be able to discover the truth. Cain leaves his presence and questions himself on why he hesitated to attack, but he was left alone and intrigued by his words, unlike any other speech. Raziel would be sure of himself to learn more secrets if he were to look for more of the truth than what he is led to believe thus far. He switches between realms to cross over the blockade and returns to the material realm. He felt a strange presence that someone might be lurking in the shadows, following his actions, so he took precaution as he opened a sealed door that required a Reaver to be unlocked. As he goes into the chamber, he depicts the murals surrounding the walls of the area, a war between the winged creatures, similar looking to Raziel, and these unknown creatures according to him. It also looks as though the Reaver was being used in every mural seen in the chamber. Assuming this is what Cain wanted him to see, the Elder God out of nowhere denounces the idea and claims that it's all false. This is their first confrontation since his time travel, and it is quite the confrontation. First of all, this is the first time we actually see the Elder God more clearly. Notice that was said in quotes because let's be real. If you go to church and later realize you were worshipping a giant squid, how would you react? Second of all, Raziel is now sketched about the Elder God, knowing that Mobius is a servant of his, and so he acts smug towards him. The elder god has the patience to deal with impudent's behavior, and so he reminds him about his task. As a Soul Reaver, he is indebted to the god and must kill Cain to bring balance to the wheel of fate. And instead of exercising his free will to see the task at hand, he instead let Cain slip away from his grasp when he had the chance to kill him. But as Raziel states that he serves no one, he also made sure of himself that Cain indeed should die, but the time to make that decision will be up to him. So Raziel embraces himself by diving underwater and swimming through the cave to resurface on the other side, only to find another chamber in the ruins. While solving a puzzle or two, Raziel discovers another mural shown to him on the walls, and it was another different portrait between the winged creatures who carried the Soul Reaver against these unknown creatures. After solving the puzzle area, Raziel discovers that these ruins happen to be forges to enhance the Soul Reaver as an elemental weapon, as such, the Dark Reaver. With his elemental Reaver, he has a means to pass through the other sealed doors that require the dark substance, and as he leaves, the lurker shows himself none other than Vorador. Watching him since his arrival in Mobius' sanctuary, he's quite curious whether Raziel is the reasoning for the corruption of the pillars or the salvation to the problem. But he responds as a neutral. Regardless, in this era, the tables have turned this time to where the vampire race is about to be extinct, with the human race winning. Raziel questions about the murals and the pictures. Vorador explains that they were a race long forgotten from the world to the point where it became nothing but fairy tales. If he were to seek more answers about them, then he would have to find Janos Ordrin. But because it's been centuries long since his death, he needs to go to the time chamber and travel back to the past. Unfortunately, the only way to gain entry into the stronghold is to shoot these crystal balls above the door using the Sunlight Reaver. And in order to get this Reaver, we have to open another forge room and solve the puzzles in here just like last time. After getting the Sunlight Reaver, we can unlock this door to enter through the stronghold. Raziel will arrive in the main hallway, seeing as there's a few corpses lying around, feeling the presence of Cain. They both meet where King William the Just holds the Reaver Blade. Okay. It's hard to tell you exactly who King William the Just is, assuming that's another story from Blood Omen, but basically, Cain and William got into a battle in the past, and William was about to eliminate the rest of the circle after only 3 have survived. To my understanding, he was corrupted by Mobius, which led him to attack. But somehow, Cain traveled back in this time to clash with William as the two Reavers collided, with one of them being broken. So Cain grabs the Reaver from the statue of William and drew himself close to Raziel. Raziel warns Cain to distance himself, while he keeps himself on guard. But as he draws close in arm's length, Raziel's Reaver summoned out of his own will, willing to grasp onto the blade. Cain passes him the actual Reaver, telling him he has nothing to fear. He took advantage to show him fear as he tested his theory, but before he was willing to go with the plans, the Reaver began to take over, and began to follow this predetermined destiny Cain was talking about. With him holding onto the Reaver, destiny is calling upon him to exterminate Cain with his own weapon, otherwise the Reaver would then take over Raziel. Cain tests him to embrace his free will, to break free of this destiny that was prematurely set for him. He was very close, but he didn't want something like the Reaver to take control of what he wanted to do. So he uses all of his strength to seize the Reaver from impaling Cain, but after resisting to go with the plans, the world embraces for another paradox. So if we go back to the first Soul Reaver, right after their battle, when Cain tried to kill Raziel, he knew even before then that the Reaver could not kill Raziel, simply because he was not imbued with the Soul Reaver, just yet, which then created the first paradox. And after the second paradox, things have now shifted for the future. The way Cain says poor William is so subtle, yet so powerful.
Poor William.
Cain believes this is a step in the right direction as the guardian of balance, but Raziel is baffled in how fixated Cain is, thinking that he'll use him as an advantage to do his bidding. He grows tired of everyone around him and merely only seeks to go into the time chamber and unlock the door with the Sunlight Reaver. Mobius enters the room with a surprised look and once again pulls a stupid move, showing up without his staff. Remember, he even said that was his one and only chance, when really he gave him 2. And he still spared you. Mobius warns Raziel about Cain's lies and his deceitful words. He also questions why he didn't kill him when he had the chance. Beginning to believe that he was now serving Cain, Raziel simply showed mercy and didn't feel the need to kill him in the moment just yet. He also doesn't want to be reminded about being the savior of Nosgoth, As much as he knows right now, he believes it's pointless, and rather than killing Mobius, he forces him to work the time chamber so that he can travel to a time he can meet Janos, but instead of traveling to the past, he traveled to the future. In this timeline, the state of Nosgoth and the Pillars have collapsed, with the world now shattering into a dark, gloomy era. 1 century has passed. The stronghold, along with the chronoplast time chamber, has been long abandoned, and the demons rip open portals and invade the material realm. And Mobius is long gone, with a monumental statue of him holding the head of the vampire Vorador. After Vorador's death, this marked the annihilation of the vampire race. With this in mind, he knew that Mobius sent him here to be trapped. While on his way out of the stronghold, he meets Mobius in his spirit form. And if you paid any attention, you know that Mobius can travel both the material and the spectral realm, since he does serve the Elder God. With this act he puts on, he's so manipulatively deceptive, playing the victim card as he blamed Raziel for condemning him and the world to the hideous scene as they see before him, even though he has accepted the fact that Cain killed him. Raziel doesn't buy any of it. He's more aware of the fact that despite Cain having to fulfill a predetermined destiny, and is self-aware that the course of history has to change. Cain, to some extent, is acting on his own free will. Thing is, his ending is the same no matter the change throughout his course. Him, along with the vampire race, is doomed. Unlike Raziel, he may have a destiny set to save Nosgoth, but instead is looking for answers by choice. His free will allows him to change history and the ending to the story. With this in mind, Mobius can't tell what either of them will do, which causes him to worry. Raziel threatens Mobius by only slightly unveiling the scarf to test and see if he really were a spirit, but after vanishing quickly, the answer was clear as day. Raziel leaves the stronghold and arrives at the Pillars, where he finds Ariel lurking around like the ghost she still is. But of course, this is only a century past since her death, and so she's not aware of Raziel as of yet. Ariel is in complete distraught. She's so fixated on Cain's refusal to the sacrifice that binds her here. Raziel reassures her that the dark entity has taken her life, and what began the corruption from the start. He even calls her out for blindly blaming Cain for not condemning his sacrifice, to which may bound her for eternity. She tries to hide in the spectral realm, but Raziel was quick to switch realms and meet her again, continuing to shame her for influencing him to kill all the Guardians and admit to his purpose in the end. All she wanted at this point was to be left alone. Raziel leaves Ariel in peace and continues his road. He then returns to the mural chamber, where the Elder God lies underneath the Pillars, announcing Raziel's failure in assassinating Cain and letting him roam free. Each time Raziel learns more about Nosgoth and its past, the more he looks down on the Elder God as a parasite, losing his trust in him. Raziel then traverses to the northern mountains of Nosgoth to find the sanctuary Janos used to hide in, but as it turns out, as expected, that the area is nothing but an abandoned ruins, with absolute certainty that he wouldn't be able to unearth anything prior from those events. Before gliding over there to the canyons, Cain shows up, and Raziel was ill-prepared for the next dramatic scene to unfold, but it turns out that Cain wants to clarify that Janos is indeed the key to Raziel's altered destiny. He's also made clear that since his second paradox occurred, they're both in danger, with demons opening portals to find their ways of eliminating them. According to them, there seems to be a hierarchy being causing these commotions. Even though Mobius is the deceptive time streamer, he too is a puppet. This part always had me confused as to why Raziel asks who they're referring to. It's obvious that Cain doesn't know, at least not yet, but Raziel, he got his answer the second Mobius admitted to him that he serves the Wheel of Fate. So why ask him this question if he already knows? Unless this question is referring to a test to see if Cain would actually know. But regardless, with all the dangers ahead of them, Raziel seems certain that whoever was pulling the strings can't seem to find a way on eliminating him. But Cain warns him not to underestimate. The hierarchy will do what it takes to prevent another paradox. Cain leaves, and Raziel explores the inner cave, only to discover yet another forge. While solving the necessary puzzles to unlock the next element, he acquires the Soul Reaver. Now he can use his telekinetic projectiles from his Reaver to obliterate the cracked walls, which allows him to find the other time streaming chamber and break the wall preventing entry. He now has a way to travel back in time. Despite not knowing how to operate the device to get him to where he needs to go, he does it anyway, and actually succeeds in traveling back to where the Seraphim still lives. But now, time isn't so much on his side. Although he has to tread carefully while traversing the mountains, he has to find Janos before the Seraphim get to him for his set execution. And on his way, he does encounter the Seraphim soldiers a little before arriving at the canyons, giving him a different perspective of seeing things from both sides, whether it be a human as a Seraphim or a vampire under Kane's lieutenant. Either way, as a demon, he has to fight his way in order to pass through. Arriving at the canyons, a lot has changed. It was no longer flooded but instead frozen, bright and snowy. The lair of Janos Audron lies at the top, but with no way of traversing the platforms to reach up there. So Raziel switches between realms on the ground level. A crater on a wall will open, allowing Raziel to enter through the stronghold. But this is another puzzle room to solve where he has to connect the ramps to reach the domain. Raziel enters the room and finally greets the man he was looking for.
Janos Audron?
This scene, much like Raziel and Kane's conversation at the Pillars, is so intriguing. It's not a conflict or an argument by all means. They both have the same mutual respect for each other, and Janos speaks to him as though he already knows him well. So remember when Raziel kept seeing all those murals in the forges that showed the winged creatures? Well, they were the first vampires that watched over the Pillars, but as time moved on and their numbers were decimating, the humans seized the opportunity to take control over the Pillars for themselves and look down on the vampires as the enemies. This leads Raziel to question why the humans were summoned as guardians if they actually belonged to the vampires. The guardians of the Pillars before their death will choose upon who will be the next successor. With this problem, the vampires cannot be birthed anymore, only turned. And Raziel assumed that Janos hates the humans for condemning him as the devil he is to them. But even as a vampire, he's sympathetic for the humans. His response was very humbled and self-aware that the humans fear what they don't understand and they are easily manipulated, unlike Vorador, who finds it hard to forgive them. Raziel feels bummed for feeling like he was manipulated like the humans were, especially when being called a messiah. But Janos believes his role is much more crucial than he realizes. Janos is also part of a guardian circle, but unlike everybody else, he doesn't have his own pillar. Instead, he is sworn to protect the Reaver, not just for the sake of the pillars, also because he knew that one day this Raziel would be the one to come back and reclaim the Reaver, in which Janos protected for him. The pillars are the lock, and the Reaver is the key. Unveiling the Reaver to Raziel, he felt sketched about holding the Reaver, but because it's not imbued by the curse, this is why he doesn't feel anything with the Reaver, at least not yet. So there's this section where you have to shoot a wall to go outside and get a different element for your Reaver. And when Janos and Raziel were talking up on the balcony, the camera moves towards the bottom where that crater was busted open, leaving them to be screwed as the Seraphim barged into the lair and ran up the ramps. Janos sort of teleports Raziel to another room, saving him in the act, but why didn't he teleport with the Reaver and Raziel escaping the mountains? Well, anyway, Raziel can't enter through the door to Janos' room because it requires the Fire Reaver. So he has to go through one more puzzle in the forge and acquire the Flamed Reaver, and so that he can unlock the door. By the time he arrived, it was too late. One of the leaders of the Seraphim priests unveils himself, the human Raziel. Oh my goodness, why does his face look like a doll? This is awful to look at. Oh, never mind, switch back to the original. Yeah, he looks better this way. Wow, okay. So, the human Raziel rips Janos' chest and takes the Heart of Darkness. Him and his brother steal the heart and the Reaver and escape the lair. The Raziel we know held on to Janos apologetically before he dies. He wanted to at least save his life for once so that he can embrace his destiny and reclaim the Reaver. It's amazing how when he discovered his tomb back in the first game, he thought his human self was honorable and the Seraphim were fighting to do what's right. But later discovering that it was all a lie, not only does he now reject everything that he was, but is now aware of Mobius' orchestration to all this. He's vowed to eliminate his human self and his brothers, and to take the Reaver and the Heart of Darkness back from them. And just like that, it's starting to become a full circle. By escaping the mountains and pursuing the Seraphim stronghold, Raziel is once again stopped by the demons that kept appearing out of their own realm. To his surprise, this was his punishment whenever he either disobeyed Mobius or the Elder God. It gets so bad that they'll even invade the spectral realm. Speaking of Elder God, even as far back as the Seraphim timeline, the Elder God is still present, except one thing. In this timeline, he's seen with only a few tentacles, but in the future, he's evolving into something massive despite the corruption or the collapse of the pillars. Maybe it's just me. But these are some strange questions you start to ask, like, how was the Elder God connected to the pillars? What makes him evolve into something like this? Does he leech on for the humans or the vampires? And is he an actual life, death, and rebirth prophecy he so claims to be? Poor Raziel is probably the only one who knows about this kind of thing, because unless vampire skins is as tough as Rahab, they can't even touch water, let alone salt water. And as for the humans, none of these forged ruins or anything around the pillars were man-made. Otherwise, those sealed doors wouldn't require a Reaver to lock them out. Other than Raziel, maybe Mobius. But as far as we know, it's not clear to us for now until the end. Or in the next game. He soon arrives at the stronghold, passing through the main hallway, and encountered the Reaver laying on the counter, assuming it wasn't guarded up until he got close to it, for Mobius and one of the Seraphim commanders, Malik, to show up as a surprise. Mobius came prepared for once, bringing his staff and neutralizes the Soul Reaver, disarming him. Mobius has now shown his true colors, knowing Raziel's intentions and fooling him to believe he had the advantage of changing history. Without even thinking about it, blinded by rage, Raziel picked up the Reaver and charged after Mobius and Malik, but the door shut on him. By going the other way and into the courtyard, he was stopped by his lower human brothers, Malchiah and Siphon. Eager to see what the Reaver was capable of, he sought to use the weapon against these two. Since the Reaver isn't cursed, its original purpose was to suck the blood out from its victims, strengthening the host and replenish any damage at an instant, making Raziel invincible with the Reaver. Rahab and Dumas were the next to encounter, and because they were his next opponents, he comes to realize how this all seems choreographed. Him being responsible for the deaths of his brothers that would later be resurrected by Cain a millennium later. After killing them, he encounters his missing brother from the last game, Terrell. Him and Dumas, who was responsible for throwing Raziel into the abyss. His brother suffered his fate, and now it was Terrell's turn. We're nearly at the end, confronting human Raziel.
So, you've come to avenge that filthy parasite and reclaim his foul heart. You're a righteous fiend, aren't you? Apparently I am.
And let me tell you, if you thought Raziel was smug throughout the whole second game, human Raziel is an absolute dick.
Did you hear his cowardly screams when I tore that black heart out of his carcass? I renounce you. And so it ends. My history comes full circle.
But before thinking about the Heart of Darkness, his Wraith Reaver comes back, leaving Raziel and merges with the actual Reaver. Then the Reaver acted upon itself by turning towards its host to consume. Raziel reveals that he didn't feel anything from the Reaver beforehand was because he himself is and always was the curse inside the Reaver. With Raziel merging with the Reaver, this is how it became the Soul Reaver. At just a nick in time, Cain appears. Raziel believed this was his destiny Cain talked about. It seems they both share a similar fate. Cain having to kill all the Guardians but also realizes he has to die, and Raziel having to kill himself and his brothers but has to accept his fate in being with the Reaver. But Cain steps in to create yet another paradox.
Now you are free to reclaim your true destiny, Raziel.
But by doing that, new memories surge within his visions. The events of Blood Omen 2.
Behind Cain's eyes, I could see new memories blooming and dying as history labored to reshuffle itself around this monumental obstruction. And I could see by the dawning horror on his face that perhaps we had strained history too far this time. That by trying to alter my fate, he may have introduced a fatal paradox. My God. The Hilden. We walked right into their trap.
And he warns Raziel before falling into the spectral realm that Janos must stay dead. The Wraith Reaver is still with him, and although the full circle may have finally been broken, the game is still rigged with new events to unfold. It's funny. The first two times you watch this ending, it feels bittersweet. But then you start to revisit these scenes more than twice. There's a lot to unfold with the story. It's heavily packed with rich content, especially with time travel from centuries to a millennium. Soul Reaver 2's story is an absolute one-up. Not just because we have cutscenes, but the voice actors once again deliver the performances of who these characters are. There is not a single person who comes across as a cringe. Every one of them handled their characters like professionals. It's awesome. With that long run out of the way, we can finally get into the second gameplay. And to start this off, the controls for both versions are the same, so there's no change between running, jumping, gliding, or even swimming. We'll talk about exploration first before getting into combat. In the original, you're given a compass this time, and in the remaster, it's on both games, but personally, the compass never seemed to be a useful tool to me. Traversing the lands and jumping on the platforms are the same like the last game, but now the landscapes have completely changed since we traveled a millennium in the past. There's a lot of environment and more detail this time. There are still quite a few empty spaces, but comparably speaking, the world feels more alive, whereas here in the first game feels deserted and dead. Glyphs, artifacts, and glyph points are all gone, and instead the puzzles that we solve are in forges where we unlock an elemental power for our Reaver. We have the Dark Reaver, the Sunlight Reaver, the Arrow Reaver, and the Flamed Reaver. Block puzzles aren't the high focus here this time, instead they make you do a variety of things in order to get that power. It could range from using sunlight beams, donating a heart to release a soul, defeating a certain enemy to gain entry to a door, or even using elemental reavers already unlocked to open a passage or create a passage. By inserting the Dark Reaver inside the architects on the ground, it will create a walkway for a short time. The Sunlight Reaver allows you to open doors after shooting crystal balls, or to brighten the room to solve a puzzle. The Arrow Reaver allows you to break certain walls that are cracked, and using an architect on the ground similar looking to the elemental design will allow Raziel to fly upwards. The Flame Reaver allows you to break the glaciers to enter through the stronghold one last time. Cool. Besides enemies and doors blocking your path, you also have these things. You never want to get caught in them, because the second you do, you're instantly back into the spectral realm, like diving into water for the first time. Using the Dark Reaver to shoot a projectile will cover them for a short period of time. When you have to build up the ramps to get to Janos, you have to scoop up some blood using a cup and putting it in a chalice to activate that ramp, and crystal balls to shoot at with the Sunlight Reaver to reveal a hidden path. These puzzles feel more creative than just your generic block puzzles that need to match the look or connecting the tubes together. That probably has to do with the limits they had on the original hardware when making the first Soul Reaver. While on your travels in Nosgoth, you'll find these post checkpoints in certain spots. If you die in the spectral realm, you'll be sent back to the last checkpoint you touched. These vases, called the elemental fonts, are scattered across these landscapes. Much like the fire pit, you can swing the Reaver over and it changes the element. These show up whenever Raziel unlocks an elemental ability from the forge, but also keep in mind that these shadow figures safeguard the elemental fonts and will attack you, so they have to be defeated first before you can change the Reaver. So without the glyphs, we only have 3 options, and whichever is your select button: shifting, Reaver, and the map. The remaster has a map for the first game, but it's a list of selective legends on the map rather than using a cursor to explore freely. The second game had its own map on the original and the remaster. Shifting is exactly what you expect, from material to the spectral. It's the same case where the music changes to a ghostly monotone feeling and the environment is a ghostly atmospheric distortion. Water is still non-existent, and certain platforms are distorted, and sometimes platforms or even cracks will open a way for you to progress. One thing about the spectral realm in the second game is that they went all in on trying to make the spectral realm look similar to Outworld, with the saturation in the background looking purple, but at least everything sorta has that subtle echoing, and that's pretty cool. However, as nice as this game looks on both sides, it falls short on some things. For one, there are no portals this time, which is a tragic idea. These lands may be smaller than the first Soul Reaver, but that doesn't mean it's less annoying to travel. You spend more time running across a streamline back and forth that sometimes it feels linear even after using the time chamber twice, going into the future and the past, where the only thing that changes is the weather setting and the water from either outside or under the cave. Not to mention, since there are no glyphs to unlock or artifacts to pick up, we barely have any new explorations to go around on either mid-game or post-game, so every room you go to only serves a purpose in continuing the story and moving on to the next room. This wasn't mentioned while going over Soul Reaver 1, my bad, but when you save a game, all you had to do was pause and save right there. The only thing about it is that it doesn't matter where you saved, you always start at the beginning, but as long as you unlock portals, again, traveling is instant, and you're almost back to where you were before. In the second game, you have to look for these save points. They're not too scarce, but it's also not like Kingdom Hearts where you can easily find these save points. It's not too much of a big deal, but sometimes when saving a game is crucial, you're in a position where not only are you far from any save point, but also in the middle of either a cutscene or stuck in a forge room with no means of leaving until it's done. Now let's talk about combat, and there's a lot to bring up. Now you would think that because this is a sequel there should be some improvements from the last game. Well, to some extent.
The answer is yes and no.
Let's start with the Reaver. Beforehand we would lose the Reaver after getting hit once, but in the Spectral realm it stays with you at all times. When Razio first picks up the Reaver Blade, his Wraith Reaver somehow evolved to where Razio can now summon it out of his own will without relying on full health. But because of such, we now have a separate gauge for the Reaver. Summoning it at will and having a secondary attack is good and all, but it is a Soul Reaver, so whenever killing an enemy and their soul's released, the Reaver will consume it in its own gauge meter and not your health. With the gauge meter filling up, it not only enhances the Reaver and allowing you to kill your enemies instantly, but it also eats up your health by a lot. So even if you wanted to go on a killing spree, at some point you do have to put away the Reaver. The context behind this does make sense. Some individuals might find that annoying, and personally it would be fine altogether if the weapons worked as well as it should. Speaking of which, the staff and torches are all still here, but we also have new weapons like the sword and staves, so even without the Reaver, despite being able to summon it whenever, there are way more weapons laying around, whether it be on the wall or an enemy soldier dropping them after their defeat. Raziel now has a secondary attack. Using Bear Claws will launch the opponent with a kick. Single-handed weapons do a lift-up attack, and with a two-handed weapon you can slam opponents to the ground and send them away with a horizontal swing. Or the Reaver, of course, you can do a spin attack and follow it up with an impale. Other than the Reaver and all other abilities that you still have from the first Soul Reaver, the telekinetic projectile is still with you. Locking onto an enemy and moving around is still the same for the most part, but now we have a block button. It's helpful, but when an enemy is going for a strong attack, you can't block those and have to move out of the way. We have a wide variety of different enemies this time, but we don't have huge monsters to deal with like Razio's transformed brothers. Instead, we have enemies like the vampire hunters, the undead warriors that protect the forges, and demons that invade the material realm. We still fight against the scavengers in the spectral realm, however, the Dementors don't exist anymore. Instead, we have bigger scavengers. The undead warriors are whatever, but the humans are not your average grunts like Dumas' kids. These hunters are aggressive on the vampires, and their sworn duty is to get rid of Raziel no matter what, unless you're away from their perspective. The demons, on the other hand, know how to deal damage, and if you're not careful with how you fight against them, don't be surprised when your health is this low after the fight. Which brings us to the negative side of things when it comes to combat. And the first thing that needs to be addressed is the telekinetic projectile. Because our secondary attack is either triangle or Y, whichever controller you're using, means that the telekinetic projectile can only be used when aiming, and the projectiles in the second game are weak. Not only is it a chore to aim and center the reticle, but also it takes an ungodly amount of times to cause the opponents to become dizzy, regardless of whichever Reaver you're using. Oh, the Flame Reaver? No longer a two-shot kill. Now it takes more than 10 hits before they finally burn. What's just as bad is that you can't shoot projectiles while swimming underwater anymore. Reaver or no Reaver. How did we go backwards on this? The Reaver is enhanced. We can't shoot underwater, but we can swim perfectly fine with the Flame Reaver? This was my favorite ability in the first game, but instead got nerfed so hard in the second game. That also applies to throwing weapons. They don't do anything other than baby damage. It doesn't impale anybody despite the distance. Clearly you can see this being thrown directly at this dude's head. But okay, if we're on the same level, sure, maybe their thick armor has something to do with it. That's easy to understand. But not when it comes to the undead or the demons. May as well get into the battles, which admittedly are harder this time. There's nothing wrong with difficulty, but when there's more than 4 soldiers and 2 demons coming after you, you're dealing with a stampede full of damage. It's worse if you got a whole gang and a shooter is on the other side making things worse for you. Now forget everything else around you. The shooters need to go first before handling everyone else. They'll never stop unless you kill them first, or you just say screw it and dip, because that's honestly the easy way out. There's one thing to add. No boss fights. You can't even consider your human brothers to be bosses because they fight exactly the same way as all the other vampire hunters fight. And my last complaint about combat is the dodging mechanics. Oh boy. When going up against human Raziel and his brothers, they're relentless. When certain mechanics don't work like they should despite my efforts, we have a problem. Raziel can move so swiftly anywhere in the first game. And yes, he can move here, but when surrounded by more than one enemy and they're all attacking, you have no chance of survival sometimes. This may be the last part of the game and holding on to the Reaver makes you invincible and all, but it's still annoying that dodging can mostly be ineffective when pressured. Not only that, you can't even dash forward and attack the same way. You most likely miss your target than actually get a hit at all. Look, it's not the worst thing. It may be flawed, but it's still an enjoyable game. This is not to throw hate on Soul Reaver 2 at all. In fact, we haven't even mentioned the music. Much like the cutscenes and the voice actors, the music also contributes to be one of the most powerful soundtracks in any video game. They knew how to do it right with Soul Reaver. Both games got me either bumping my head or humming the tune. Surely you heard some of them playing while watching the video. It's eerie, but in a good way. The last thing that needs to be covered is the bonus content in the launcher app. This lets you see everything from concept arts, behind the scenes, promo arts, video trailers, the Dark Chronicles to understand the story a little more. Hell, they even have the music player, so you get the soundtrack from both games in lossless quality. The bonus content is packed with good stuff, man. It's worth checking out. Now here's the one question everybody wants to know. Is this remaster worth buying? Yes. It doesn't matter if you have the original games, the mods on your PC, or if you've never played it before. They don't just bring Soul Reaver back for no reason. So give them the support and see if they can do anything about a new series. Or even remastering Defiance and the Blood Omen games. You want a good story? Soul Reaver will deliver. But don't be surprised if you get surrounded with a bunch of questions and can't follow along. If someone tells you this is a William Shakespeare movie, believe them on that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a wrap. You heard me talk your ear out long enough, so you can rest easy. It's the end. 4 games is a big project. So we'll go back to 1 this time. After all, this is the year of 2025. Let's make it a good one. Well, that's it for me. Salute.